A couple of weeks ago I made a video that featured this Technics SL6 turntable. A lot of people asked me to show it sat on top of my Technics cassette receiver, so here it is. Now these two weren't designed to go together. I'm not just talking about the colour. The Cassiva is a K5L. The turntable that was supposed to go with that was the SL5. This SL6 turntable came out the year after and incorporated a sync record feature that would activate the tape recorder on the K6. My K5 doesn't have that socket, but of course everything else works normally. You just don't get that auto sync record activation. But now onto the subject of this video. I've been looking for a turntable to put under my television. It's not to replace the main record player, it's just an additional one so I can listen to records in another part of the house. Now after testing out that SL6, I decided it would be a good idea to use a black SLQ6 for this. I chose black rather than silver because I want all the stuff under the television to be almost invisible when I turn the lights down to watch a movie. And I wanted the Q6 over the normal 6 because it added quartz lock and also did away with that odd half-cover blanking plate on the top. But in the end I didn't get myself a Q6. Instead I got a later model from the range, the Technics SL-J300R. Now the SL6 was the first Technics compact record sleeve size linear tracking turntable with direct access, and the J300R was, as far as I'm aware, the last in the range. Because the J300 remained on sale into the 1990s, a used model turns out to be a lot easier to find than a Q6 would, and it also seems they only made them in black. But now I've got both models here, the first and last of the line. It makes sense to compare them, well it does to me, one against the other. The first thing you'll notice is that the J300 is slightly wider than the Q6. Now I'm guessing once they discontinued their Cassiva range they didn't need to restrict themselves down to such a narrow width, and this size is more in keeping with the MIDI hi-fi units of that era. Looking at some of the other differences between the two turntables, first off the controls. On the left hand side we've got the sensitivity slider switch for the sensor which determines where the tracks begin and end. On the right is the speed control. In the lid we've got the manual size slider. Well, on the J300R that's all been simplified down, consolidated onto the right hand side of the turntable, which makes a lot more sense. Now for me, I can leave these switches in the central position for the vast majority of my record collection. However, if I wanted to play a 12-inch 45, I could slide the bottom onto the right, or if I had a 7-inch 33, I could slide it to the left, or if I want to control everything manually, or I've got a clear record, I can just slide the top switch to the right. You can see the difference in the mechanisms between the two models here, just looking at the lid, how the SL6 is using half of the lid for the device that determines the size of the disc. There are two motors in this, one to drive the tone arm on the right and this one on the left, which drives this sensor which moves in that diagonal motion to determine where the edges of the disc are. Of course, by the time the J300R came out, they've incorporated that into the device that's next to the tone arm here. So this is all pulled across with just the one motor in this mechanism. Makes it simpler and no doubt cheaper to manufacture. Now there's a control included in the lid of the SL6 which enables you to determine the position the stylus is put down on the record. You can adjust it slightly with that. That has been more sensibly moved to the base of the more modern device, and it's now a thumb wheel rather than something you'd have to turn with a coin. The quartz lock should facilitate better speed regulation. Unfortunately, I can't demonstrate that using the RPM app because I can't close the lid on the turntable with the phone in place. Instead, I'm having to use my strobe disc. So I'm going to demonstrate this at 33 1/3, which means we're looking at the outermost ring on this disc. And when played, it should look like it's standing still. So on the SL6, the older turntable without the quartz lock, you can see it's doing a very good job. I mean, you would not be able to hear any problem with this, but you can see it is just moving ever so slightly quickly. So let's try this now with the SL-J300R with its quartz lock, and you'll see that is not moving. It's being held perfectly at the exact right speed. One thing I should mention about this turntable, it goes for the other one as well, it uses a P-mount cartridge, which is a good system. It's just they don't make them anymore. Nobody's making new ones. So if you want a P-mount cartridge, you're going to have to go looking in the second-hand market. You might be able to find a new old stock one or something, but they can get up there in price. So if you do get one of these, make sure it has a cartridge on it that you can just then replace the stylus on. The stylus is listed on the back of the machine helpfully as well, and that's what I did with mine. One thing that's reduced on the new model is the number of tracks you can select. On the SL6 you could jump to 10 tracks per side of a record, whereas on this one it's only got 8 buttons. I say only, it's really not that big a deal. I'll go into that later on, but yes, that is something that has been a downgrade perhaps. And as we mentioned earlier on, it is a larger record player than the previous model, so it doesn't fit neatly on top of this old Caseva. But I've got to say, it is not a large record player. It's still a very compact model and just slightly larger than an album cover in width. It's still the same depth as the previous model. Some of the changes are just to do with fashion, though. You can see how the Technics logo has morphed over time. This gold and black design screams late 1980s, early 90s. These round feet at each corner are particularly reminiscent of that period. I remember seeing them on many different hi-fi components around this time. They do perform a function, though. They are dampened, so they prevent vibrations getting through to the turntable. However, there were feet on the early device that performed the same function, but on this one they were set back and not on display. Despite a few fashion changes, there's no real noticeable difference in the quality between these two devices. To say they were put together perhaps 10 years apart, over that period of time many manufacturers would have found ways to cut corners, reduce costs, cheapen things down. These both feel very well put together. There are very few changes around the back of the turntable, but why change anything when you got it right first time with the recessed sockets underneath, which means you can push the turntable up against a wall. All the wires can be unplugged from their respective sockets as well. There is just one slight change though. The earth connector has a central pin on this one, which means it uses a different wire to the previous turntable. Now, I didn't have the wire with this when I bought it. However, I went on eBay and someone was selling newly manufactured ones. I could have put something together myself, but I'm sure this one will fit a little bit better. The controls for manually moving the arm on the previous turntable were a little bit counterintuitive. You'd press the queuing button to raise the arm up, but then the start and stop buttons doubled up as left and right, as you can see from the arrows written above them. On the new one they've separated that out. We've still got the queuing button, but we've now got additional buttons for left and right. The turntables operate differently to one another. On the SL6 you can put a record on, close a lid, and absolutely nothing will happen until you press the start button to play the whole record, or press one of the individual track selection buttons, which then brings it into this automated mode which scans the record and will play the tracks in the order you've selected. On the newer model, as soon as you close the lid, it will scan that record and will light up your track selections on the front panel, at which point again you can play the whole record if you wish, or you can mess around with the program by deselecting tracks that you're not interested in, or press the buttons in the order that you're interested in the tracks being played. So in this case it will play track 5 first and then move on to track 2 when it's finished. The track that's currently playing is indicated by a flashing light on the front panel, and any that are due to be played are lit up. Now you can deselect any of those programs or add to them if you wish. You can also skip forward to the next track in the program by holding down the search button, and you can activate a repeat function as well. In fully automatic mode, the turntable recognises 7-inch, 10-inch and 12-inch records. Of course, it plays these at the most common speeds, so a 7-inch record will play at 45 RPM. But these things can be overridden. If you want, you can play a 7-inch record at 33 1/3 or a 12-inch at 45. For any odd-sized or unusually shaped vinyl, you can use the manual controls. Put it into manual and you can pick the arm up, move it across the record and pop it down in whatever position you want, and choose between 33 1/3 or 45 RPM. I'm an alligator. Of course, any record whose size can't be determined by the automatic sensor system, like this clear one, should be played in the manual mode. It works a little bit differently on this turntable than the previous one, because it puts the arm above the 12-inch position, but it's down to you to press the queuing button to bring it down on the record. It also gives you the opportunity then to move the arm around on the record if it's a different size to a 12-inch. That's different to the SL6, whereas if you deactivate the size sensor on this one, it assumes it's a 12-inch record and just puts the stylus straight down in that position immediately. And if you've been playing a 7-inch or a 10-inch record, that would have resulted in the stylus dragging along the slip mat. Now, just circling back around to talk about the individual track selectors, how it's reduced from 10 on the previous turntable down to 8 on this one. Now, that doesn't stop you from playing any record. You can play a record from the beginning to the end. You can move the arm around it manually. You can do everything you can with a normal record player. It's just the previous one had 10 buttons on there. So at the push of a button, you could jump to one of 10 tracks per side of a disc, whereas on this one, you can only jump to one of 8 tracks per side. That said, I really had to look through a lot of records in my collection before I found any that maxed this out. 8 does seem to be about the maximum, though, of most of my records. I can't find very many that are more than this, so I can see why they picked 8 as a number. In fact, most modern records, even when they're re-releases of older records, they tend to now split them over multiple discs and just put, say, 4 or 5 tracks per side. I did manage to find one record, though, that had 20 tracks. Of course, we've now got 10 tracks aside. So what happens if you put a 10-track album on a machine that can recognise 8 tracks? Well, I think most people will be able to figure it out. It recognises the first 8 tracks. So now I can pick from any of those just by pushing a button. It will jump to one of the first 8 tracks. What happens when it gets to 8? Well, it considers any track after that to be a continuation of 8. So if you jump to track 8, you'll play track 8, 9 and 10 on this particular record. Not a problem. You can play the whole record from beginning to end, just like you can on any normal turntable. You can pick the arm up, put it down on any position of the record that you want to. There's nothing restrictive here. It just enables you to also select from the first 8 tracks at the push of a button. Now, one thing I've barely mentioned over the course of these videos is the fact that these are linear tracking turntables. Now, you'll see people saying, oh, linear tracking, that's the best, isn't it? That's so much better than the normal system. Well, in these turntables, it won't really make all that much difference. The reason linear tracking is in here is to facilitate the design. It enables them to have a nice small footprint with an arm that travels inside the lid, something you couldn't do with a traditional mechanism. But when you hear hi-fi experts telling you about how much better linear tracking is when it comes to inner groove distortion and all those kind of things, they're really talking about the high end. In a small consumer model like this, it would barely make any audible difference. But getting back to talking about differences, let's have a look at some LEDs. You switch the old one on, there's no LED on the left there. There is, however, one that comes on the right to tell you the power's on, but it's on the queuing button, which just seems a bit odd. The newer one is a lot more sensible. Turn the power on, you get a separate LED just for that next to the button. But you also get all these other LEDs come on as long as you've got a record in it, because it immediately scans the record and lights those up depending upon how many tracks there are on that disc. But we have lost an LED. If we look at this scale here, you can see that this is just drawn on the lid. Whereas you compare that to the older version, we've got a nice little LED that follows the arm along as it moves. Now let me tell you how I went about connecting the turntable up to my AV receiver that doesn't have a built-in phono preamp. The turntable requires one, but I didn't really want to plug one in permanently behind the TV. There's too much stuff plugged in already. So instead I bought an external phono preamp that's powered via USB. It doesn't cost all that much, and the idea behind this is really more for digitizing your audio. You'd plug a turntable or a cassette player into this. It comes with software for digitizing that on your computer, and I honestly couldn't care any less about that. I've no intention to use any of those features at all. If I'm playing a record, I'm playing a record. I don't want to digitize it, but I can plug this into a spare port on the back of my satellite receiver, and now I've got a USB-powered phono preamp. Now, you might have spotted that this has got a headphone output on it. That'll be so you can monitor what you're digitizing on your computer. But what I'm going to do with it is plug a turntable into the back. I'll plug the headphone output into the mic input on this camera, and we can listen to a direct feed audio from this turntable. And we'll be listening to a snippet from this record, Retro Grooves Volume 3. Side B, track 2, Borderline. Now this has come from Anders Enger Jensen, who's a good friend to the channel. I'm not on commission for these. There'll be a link to it though in the video description text box. We'll have a listen first through the J300R and then the SL6. So there you go, that's the end of the video. Let's just wrap this up. I'm very happy with my J300R. These things are getting a little bit long in the tooth now, so there's no guarantee if you buy one of these it's going to work forever. Nothing ever does, but these ones might work for a shorter amount of time than other turntables that you buy today. But then again, they are a heck of a lot better, in my opinion. It seems like every manufacturer has lost the keys to the cupboard that had all the technology in it, and all they can do now is make the most basic of basic turntables, which is a great shame. If you want anything with this kind of functionality in this kind of form factor, you've got to buy old, second-hand. There'll be the usual affiliated links to auctions in the video description text box. You'll also find links to that phono preamp which runs off USB, and of course to Anders' album, which you can get from his website, and I believe it's also available on the 8-Bit Guy's website if you're in the US. It saves a lot on postage if you get it from there. The postage from Norway, I believe, costs quite a bit. Anders says there's nothing I could do about it. He apologises, but that's just the way it is. Anyway, that's it for the moment. As always, thanks for watching.